Thank you everybody for coming to join us at our Mirima Linguistic Forum today. It's the 17th time that we're doing this, and today I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Greg Dickson, who is from the University of Queensland but lives in K-Town, a well-known town in the Northern Territory, about 500 kilometers east of here. Greg has quite a history in linguistics, so he currently is concluding a project as part of the Centre for Excellence for the Dynamics of Language, which is part of the Australian Research Council. He also has a history in the Northern Territory, once used to be the linguist for the Ngukurr Language Centre, and has been dealing with Kriol for many years, must be 14 or 16 years. Today we're looking forward to hear about a project that we were partly involved in with some of our staff. So we had Dwayne, Glenys and Jimmy and myself visit a workshop in 2015, which was also in the K-Town area. And at that time you were collecting comparative data about Kriol languages and the different varieties. So this talk is in a sense a bit of a summary of that work, and it's called Kriol of Northern Australia, a first dialectology. So thanks for coming here today, and over to you, Greg.
Cool, thank you. Thanks KJ, and thanks everyone for having me. Thank you everyone from Mirima for having me here, and thanks for coming along. So yeah, I visited here a couple of years ago as part of this project, so I just thought I'd come back and say what happened with it all. So that's what I'll talk about today. So my project is a dialectology of Kriol, and one of the first things I'll do is talk about what dialectology is. I'll give you just a bit of background on Kriol, and then I'll talk about how I carried out the project. So I will talk about the methods that I used to approach the project a little bit. I know you are thinking about doing some work on Kriol coming up here. So see if, talk about the methods I've used, and then having to go through and process and find out a few things. I'll talk a little bit about the stuff that I learned from visiting here, but it's a little bit off to the side, but I will mention a few things that I learned about Kriol and Kununurra, but I'm no expert by any means. My role, as you said, I've worked in Katherine for a long time, but I've learned Kriol a long time ago, but Kriol spoken in Ngukurr in southern Arnhem Land, so a long, long way from here. So very different context, although it's still Kriol, it's very different for me coming here and comparing differences. I don't speak like people from Kununurra. So I kind of do the best I can muddling through with Kriol here. But about dialectology, so if you've studied linguistics as it is when you go to university and study it, it kind of has all these big names that were around in the 1900s, people like Franz Boas and Saussure and Noam Chomsky and Bill Labov, all these people we learn about at university who really shaped modern linguistics, what we all think of what linguistics is today. But dialectology actually came before all of these people and predates modern linguistics. So if we go back to this guy on his bicycle here, in the late 1800s, before any of those famous linguists were around, this guy's name was Edmund Edmund. And probably people have not really heard of him. He was a dialectologist, and what he did, he was French, and he wanted to look at how French is spoken differently all over France. So he got on his bike, and he had his little list of things that he wanted to find out how people pronounce differently. Cycled around France, asked people how they said this, how they said that, wrote them all down very carefully, and that was late 1800s, and that's kind of, these were new methods that he was using to study dialects of a language and how a language, even though it's one language, French, how it might vary from place to place. So dialectology is basically just the study of dialects of a language. So this guy, Edmond, after he cycled all around France, and you can't see this very well at all, but he got together with people to map it out on an atlas. So this is taking one French word, avec moi, which means with me. And what you can't really see is written, this is a map of part of France, and written all over here, very carefully written out how it's pronounced differently in every little place in France. And so this was a linguistic atlas of France, which was produced as a result. So this is old work that came before all sort of modern linguistics. And it is still around today, this sort of study. So this is a more recent little bit of dialectology. Here's America, and this is a map of whether you say what you call soft drinks in America, whether you call it pop, whether you call it soda, or whether you call it Coke, not Coke, but any sort of like, you can have Sprite Coke or Fanta Coke. So the different colours represent, well, in which area, what do you say more? So you can see everyone that says soda lives over here, and a patch here, and a patch here, and over here. All these people call it pop, and these people call it Coke. So this is dialectology. And you can do it in Australia as well for English. If you're an English speaker, you might have come across this on the internet at some point. People arguing about when you deep fry a little thin thing of potato, what you call it. I don't know what people call it. To me, it's a potato scallop. I grew up here, it's always a potato scallop. But people argue, if you're from Melbourne, no, it's a potato cake, and other people call it other things too. So this is kind of what dialectology is. But with linguistics, modern linguistics, it's kind of been overtaken by another field called Socio Linguistics. What sort of happened is they looking at dialectology and just thinking about it in terms of geographic space, it was a little bit limiting. In sociolinguistics, you think more about why people speak differently. You consider things like how old someone is, that older people speak differently to younger people, or you think about if you're working class or upper class, you speak differently, or men speak differently to women. You bring in all these other factors rather than just geography. So sociolinguistics is more looking more widely at all these different causes of language variation, or like what sort of social groups you belong to rather than just where you're from. And then they've brought in all these new methods looking at social networks and who the people we're close to influence the way we speak. All these new methods have come into it and sort of left this dialectology behind. And so dialectology, it's fun, but it's a little bit old-fashioned in a way. So that's sort of what dialectology is. But what isn't old-fashioned is Kriol. Kriol is one of the newest languages around. So spoken in this part of the NT, and then over in the Kimberleys as well. So Kriol's only about 100 years old. So it's when the French guy was riding his bike around France, Kriol didn't even exist there. So Kriol's brand new, and so it's about 100 years old in the earliest places where it started, and don't really know how many people speak it, but the estimates are about 20,000 altogether, and pretty much all Indigenous. Very few non-Indigenous people speak it. So it's spoken over a large geographic area, but it's a very sparsely populated area when you compare it to places like France. And Kriol obviously is largely based on English, but in each place, the different traditional languages will have varying degrees of influence on the language. So just another look at Kriol. It's only 100 years, the language is only about 100 years old, but the research on Kriol, linguists looking at Kriol, is even newer still. So it wasn't really until the 70s that linguists started to actually document and describe Kriol as a language. So this is 40 years ago, it's very recent. So one of the first people was over in this area, Roper River, where I've learned Kriol, wrote a grammar of Kriol in the 70s. and you had people in another a woman in another community studying Kriol. Over in the Kimberleys, it was Joyce Hudson, who's still working for the education department, isn't she? Was one of the first people to document Kriol over this way. And you had just sort of more linguists coming in and doing different kinds of research and covering a lot of the area where Kriol is spoken. So what was happening with all this work is, when people wrote about Kriol or researched Kriol, they would usually say, well, I'm researching Fitzroy Valley Kriol, or I'm researching Barunga Kriol or Roka Kriol. They knew that their research was only specific to that area. So everybody kind of knew that it was different in each place. But no one really has tried to put those pieces together and say, well, exactly how is it different in each place? All Kriol speakers know that if you talk to someone from this area or that area, they sound different to you. But what are those differences like? So my project was trying to specifically focus on mapping out what some of those differences are. So this is the objectives of my project, which is to have a go at doing dialectology for the first time, and to figure out, well, what are these variables? And a variable is just a feature or a word that you know is different from place to place. So potato scallop or deep fried potato snack would be a variable in Australian English. We know that's different in different places. So to look at Kriol and say, well, what are these words or things that are different from place to place, and what are the differences? Do those differences cluster together to form things that we might be able to call dialects? It's a difficult question, but we can look at that as well. People who have researched Kriol have tried to propose what dialects there might be without carefully kind of analysing it. So we can look at what people have already said about dialects of Kriol and see if that matches what the reality is. And then part of the project was also to look at Kriol speakers' perspectives as well. See if, linguists looks at it from the outside, but what's the view of Kriol speakers themselves of what this variation looks like. So this was all the objectives of my project. And so just a zoomed in map of the Kriol speaking world. This is in that first Kriol researcher, John Sanderfeld. He wrote about dialects of Kriol without really carefully analysing what they might be, but he suggested there are 7 dialects. So this is what he sort of proposed what the dialects of Kriol would be. So over this way, Kununurra Creek variety, Eastern Kimberley, and then in the NT, those 5 different varieties there. This was his idea without sort of carefully being able to, justify those. As I said, my experience being a Kriol speaker, I learnt it here where I lived for 3 years working for the Language Centre. So my work experience is all around this area, and kind of that area gets labelled as being Roka Kriol, is the dialect spoken there. And then the neighbouring one gets called Barunga Kriol. So these 3 communities, Barunga, Beswick, Ormond, they all sit on one highway going up this way. These communities all sort of are near another highway going up this way. So this is the area that I'm most familiar with and where the Kriol that I've learned is most similar. So that was really the focus of the project. All the green communities, the names mapped in green there, they're all the communities actually visited for the project. So I did come over this way after the workshop that we had in Katherine, and KJ invited me over, so I took the opportunity to come. You can see it's a bit far away from the area I'm most familiar with, but it was really useful to come here as well. But the focus really was on these 2 communities. And you can talk to people, Kriol speakers in these areas, and they can tell you things like, yeah, well, we say get him in this area, and in that area they say gadyim. I think here you say get him as well, but I don't think you say gadyim, or get. And you can say, well, how do you pronounce water? And these guys will say, well, we say water, but these guys say water. or you know that there's a difference between those guys who say there or there, and over this way they say ga or der. Kriol speakers can identify these differences, but there's a bit of a difference between what we think we do or what we actually do, or where the boundaries might exist between where these terms might be used. And the other thing is, linguists know that we don't use the same word all the time. So if you're speaking more formally, you might say a word differently. If you're speaking more casually, you might say it differently. If you're speaking to someone from a different area, do you change the way you say it? So there's never really a black and white, I say it this way all the time, this person says it this way all the time. So part of the project is to look really carefully at what is going on. But those insights into what the differences are really useful, and hopefully this will play. This is from an example of Glennis showing us a difference between, I think, Roper Kriol and Kununurra Kriol. Hopefully this works.
Language Centre, we usually write our language and English, but we speak with a Kriol as well. And for the where you're gone, we would say Ujay, or where you gone, where you stand, Ujay yo Kamaramat. Which means where you stay.
So that's just an example. We can look at all these little differences between locations. But as a researcher and an academic, it's not quite good enough for me to go back to my professors at university and say, well, Glennis said that that's what they say in Kununurra and that's it, that's the end of the story. They need lots of evidence. So I had to go around and collect lots of examples of exactly how people talk to be able to say with a lot of certainty, yes, this is what's going on. So I had to develop this project, and it was really useful and challenging for a number of reasons. So one is, it was really useful in terms of documenting Kriol. So as I said, it's only been 40 years that Kriol's been researched, and a lot of that has been with older people. So my project really looked at younger people and how they're speaking, so it was really useful to be able to spend a lot more time working with younger people on how they speak Kriol. Doing this sort of work in remote communities hasn't been done all that much. So a lot of focus, quite rightly, has been on traditional languages and sitting down with elders and documenting traditional language. Socio Linguistics isn't so much focused on documenting important knowledge. Part of what Socio Linguistics wants to do is just get people talking and hear how people talk really naturally. So this hasn't been done all that much in remote communities, so it was kind of interesting to try and figure out how to do that. How to do dialectology in a new way that didn't require bicycles, and and then really being able to understand the geographic variation in Kriol. So we know that all this work in Kriol just hasn't really been done before, and it hasn't actually been done all that much on Kriol languages. So Kriols are spoken all over the world, in the Caribbean and Africa and in the Pacific. This sort of work hasn't been done all that much on Kriols either, so it was pretty interesting to try and tackle it. And how we do this is with this method called sociolinguistic interviews. And really, like I said, it's just a way to try and get people talking and talking a lot and very naturally and comfortably, so that you're actually capturing how people really talk. So this is just a couple of photos from field work. What I did in these interviews, and they went well. People usually are quite happy to sit down and talk for 90 minutes, a couple of hours, a lot of words on recordings. So I tried to get people to tell stories. I would ask things, like have specific questions. Things like I'd ask people, tell a story about a time you hurt yourself playing sport. And then they'd have to think back to when they were a kid at school, and then one woman went to a basketball competition in Darwin but had no shoes and there was broken glass on the court, so she cut up her feet and told that story, and someone had a broken collarbone from football and had to go to hospital. So all these stories, and they just get people talking. So that's just really useful for this project, getting conversation going. I would always do the interviews in pairs, so I would try and I might ask the question first, and then I'd say, all right, KJ, you've answered now. You ask Josh, you ask Josh the question now. And so then you'd put it into a way that is probably a better way of phrasing the question than what I might do, and then Josh would talk back to you. So to try and foster conversation, this really natural sort of language. And to get these own perceptions, this map here is an activity I did where I drew a map of the region, and I got people to circle, to group together the communities where they thought people sounded the same and where they might sound different. So for them to map out the region in terms of what they think the dialects are. And I had a long list of words that I knew were different from place to place, so I go through those. And the other thing is this picture task, which I did. So this was something that linguists came up with. What you do in the task is you give them all these pictures in a certain order, and it's not clear what the story is. So they're talking about, well, what's on this picture and what's on that picture, and then in the end they have to put together the pictures to make a story and tell the story. So there's a lot of backwards and forwards and talking and discussing about that. So I ended up with a lot of hours of talking. I ended up doing 30 interviews altogether across those 10 places with 60 people. That's the number of people I interviewed in each place. So, I mean, the map looks small, but that's a lot of driving from place to place. And 48 hours of recorded material altogether. And if you're a linguist or a language worker and you've ever had to try and transcribe recordings, it takes a long time. So it was great to have that much data, but it took a long time to transcribe. Only about half of it is written out now. We did another 15 minutes this morning. Thank you, guys. I had 2 weeks at university, and 3 language workers from Ngukurr Language Centre came down and worked with 4 students from UQ. And in those 2 weeks, we got through a whole lot of transcribing. So there's about 100,000 words of Kriol written out that we can then go and use to analyse and look at what the differences are. So that's kind of the methods that we've put to the project. I was really happy with sitting down with a lot of the people I interviewed. Some of them I knew already, some of them I didn't. And I was just really surprised and pleased with how comfortable most people were just to talk to each other, tell stories, enjoy themselves telling stories, and didn't mind a weird white person speaking Kriol to them as well. These 2 are from Ngukurr, I did know them. But I'll play you just a little clip so you can sort of hear what this data sounds like. In this example, this is part of the interview where I'm going through a checklist of words to see if they know that word or not. So what I'm asking is if they know this word dilbuk. And dilbuk is a word from a traditional language called Alawa, which is spoken around Hodgson Downs community in the Northern Territory. And it means when you tip something over and it spills. So I know it comes from a specific place. I was trying to find out if everybody knows this, who knows this word or not. But of course I need to ask this in Kriol. All these interviews were done in Kriol, so you mobsabi that word dilbuk. And you can hear me say that, I think, and then you can hear the answer from these 2, Grant and Manuel.
You must have the word dilbuk.
Dilbuk.
Something fall down. I mean, like what accident. Like what if you rather would buy, can if you fall down. Well, Dilbak one, Dilbak one, then I hear my crew in on a bike after I was thinking about everyone.
And heavily one there, not 6 pound on one bike.
Yeah, but a 6 pound and one bike.
Now I'm back at Melbourne, Park Mamma, everywhere. Well, Park Mamma.
Did anyone understand what happened there?
Yes.
What was it?
Not that I know the word Dilma, but they were saying that 6 of us were on the back of the bike, and so we all fell down.
Yeah, yeah. So that was really nice. Like they're having fun telling the story, and for the language point of view, it's interesting that that meaning of tipping it over, they've extended it to like a whole bunch of people on a bike and the bike falling over. So, and, you know, they're having fun telling it. So, and that sort of stuff happened a lot. So here's a messy-looking transcript with the orange is Grant talking, and the blue is manual, and then it's got the Kriol and then an English translation underneath. So it's pretty messy, but I'll play it again and you might be able to follow bits of it.
You know something about Dilbak?
Dilbak. You kept that.
Dilbak, yeah, we
X-ray.
something fall down. We mean like our accident. Like when if you ride on a bike and if you pull down, then Dilbak. Well, Dilbak one, Dilbak one, then I hear my crew on a bike after I was thinking about everyone.
And heavily one there, not 6 pound on one bike.
Yeah, but a 6 pound and one bike.
Now I'm back at Melbourne, Park Mamma, everywhere. Well, Park Mamma.
So yeah, anyway, it was really, they're having fun telling stories, and you can see like a lot of people, I didn't have to say all that much. Like I say one little thing here after I asked the question, so it's good. I didn't, yeah, it was interesting. And you guys from Kununurra, I don't know if you can pick out some differences between how they talk.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities. So I'm from Halls Creek, so I know Halls Creek, you know, from that area. There's a bit of changes between it, but definitely a lot of changes from NT to here. But a lot of words are very much the same. Think about, you know, everybody, bike, how, you know, those are just all the same. Rarambad, all those words, yeah. You can definitely easily understand.
Yeah, but it's picking up what the differences are, because you can tell that they're different as well.
Yes.
So it's, well, what are the things that are making them sound different to Kununurra or Halls Creek? So it's all trying to unpack all of that. We were talking this morning that in Kununurra you don't really say this word, Mala.
No, we do. Yeah, no.
So what do you guys say? Asmo.
Asmo, yeah.
So yeah, there's little differences you can start to pick out. So when I, you know, looking through and there's words that I know are different from place to place. Oops, sorry. So well, I can't really see the colour change there, but I tried to mark in red here all the words that I know are actually different from place to place. So you look at a story like this and words come out all the time that kind of attaches you to a certain region or community. So yeah, in some places they say UI, in some places they say yeah more, so that was one. Mela and Akmob, everybody, this one here. Other places they'll say everybody, like without the double R. So all through the stories, there's lots and lots of examples of words that change. So the project, I started to pick some of those out, and there's 3 that I've really started to analyse closely, which takes a long time. It's going through all the transcripts and finding all the little examples and writing down all the details of when they said it, who said it, what word came before, what word came after it, to do this really careful quantitative analysis. So one word we picked out was what they've said here as lat, which is a short way of saying lagajat. I don't know what you would say in Kununurra, but lagajat, these guys shorten it right up to lat. And when I went through all the recordings, there's all different ways that this word was said. Some people said it more lagajat rather than lagijat. Some people said it layjat.
Similar to that.
How would you say it, you reckon?
Lagajat.
Yeah. Some people pronounced it layjat and then lat, like these guys did. And some people shortened it right up to la. And then some people turn around the G and the J and say lajigat. So that was another one that came up as well. So all these little differences came up, and then it's about mapping those out geographically. The other one that we looked at carefully was this miyel. So here the example is when they hit the ground, the word is bakma miyel. So slammed ourselves into the ground. So that little miyel word, here it's like that, but in other recordings it sounds like miel without the J, like miel, or shortened again miel, or shortened right down to mel. Sometimes it sounds more like an A, mijal. And then sometimes it actually has an N on the end, mijan, and then the J changed to a Y, mian. So going through all the recordings, these are all the different examples that came up. How are we going to analyse this variation? And then the third one was a very common word in Kriol, la, at, on, into, very familiar to all Kriol speakers. These guys said la in their recording. Older people, and an older form is langa, which you might be familiar with. The Bible uses that form, langa. Some people say na. Not na as in now, but just with that same meaning as la, na. And occasionally nanga. So these are the three words that I've looked at most carefully so far. So going back to this information, we look through all the recordings that are transcribed and who says what and map it all out, and then we can start to do this analysis. So looking at this term here, this locational word, which is la in Kriol, it's from the English along, so that form langa is more closely related to along, but it has all these new variants now. It translates to at, in, on, to, depending on context. And just to play more examples from the data of what these sound like, here's an example of langa, which I guess is the oldest form, or the one closest to the English form. So this is a 43-year-old woman from this community, Jokmingen. So that's that example of langa, then an example of la. This is a 26-year-old woman from Numulwa. They're out on the Gulf of Carpentaria coast.
I've walked from Denver, Metaphysical. I've walked from Denver, Metaphysical.
And then this na form. This guy speaks very quickly. He's a 27-year-old from Inyeri.
I'm running 12. Running 12.
Whoops.
Running 12.
And then this Nanga version. So this is a 39-year-old woman from Beswick community. So you can see different ages, different places.
Oops.
So I don't know what is used in Kununurra, if these na or nanga gets used, or just la and langa.
But I've heard big joke a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then,
Big joke, not just big joke.
so then part of the analysis is then to go through and look carefully, okay, what are all the examples of this word, who used it, who said what, and when and how. So we counted up 1,661 times this little word was used and did the analysis on what was the most important reason for why they said it this way and not that way. So what we do is we look at, well, where is it coming in a sentence? How old is the person? Are they male or female? What part of the interview was it in? What sound came before it? And think about all the reasons why you might say la or na. What are the what can we say that what the most important reasons are for why someone says that a certain way? So you do these sorts of statistical analyses that says, yes, where someone grew up is the most important factor deciding why you say la versus na, or whichever form you use. So knowing that geography is the biggest factor, then we can go on and look at what the patterns are. So here's 7 of the communities that I visited, and counting up all the times this preposition was used. So la is this light blue, which was used by far the most. Na is this purple, which was the next most widely used. This full form langa, you can see it actually hardly ever gets used, and in some places not at all. And this other form, nanga, hardly gets used at all, but it does come up sometimes. So, and then we can look for patterns. And what you can sort of see here is these 3 communities look like they're behaving similarly. And you can see on the map that it's those 3 communities that are all sitting on the one highway, and they're the ones that we like to think of Barunga Kriol. These other 4 communities are in this other area which is usually thought of as Roper Kriol, but you can see they actually look quite different. So these 2 communities, Jukmingan and Minyeri, they both use la and na about the same amount. Whereas these 2 communities over this way to the east, they hardly ever use na, and they're pretty much always using la. So this was one of the more interesting things, because this is usually said to be all Roper Kriol, but you've got these parts actually behaving, people there actually behaving quite differently. We can do the same with another of the words we looked at. So this one, lagijat, lajat, la. We counted up about 300 times this word was used and looked for patterns there. Only in 3 communities so far. So in Beswick community, 2 speakers said this 77 times. And we're kind of like a little bit, there was no clear pattern, except what I didn't put on here is the one where they turn around the J and the G and say lajigat. One of the women used that a lot. So she was quite different to everybody else. In Ngukurr, the 4 people that I analysed there preferred the top one there, lagidat, and the bottom one, the really short form la. And the 4 people from Minyeri, they were actually different again too, and they preferred lajat and lat, and used the ones that the Ngukurr people used a lot less. So that was a similar pattern coming out with Minyeri and Ngukurr behaving quite differently. And then this other form, which is all these versions of midel, miel, mial, mijan, mian. There's about 200 examples of that. This is a bit of a different graph, just with actual each individual speaker. And you can, this is just to show you how no individual speaks the same way all the time. So all the different colours is the different versions of this word, and you can see that no one says it the same way all the time. Depending on kind of how fast you're talking, you might say it with the J or with the Y. So you can never sort of say, oh, I say this word this way all the time. You do have to look closely for patterns. What the interesting pattern with this was is that there's a lot of different things going on in the different places. But what was really unexpected for me, what you said that in Kununurra you're familiar with Mijel?
100 turkey crickets, wildlife as well, Mijel.
With a P on the end. So what you can see here is, this is the pink coloured one. This is kind of what gets you see written down a lot, but actually in the conversation, the P we hardly ever heard. I heard it twice in the one place. So all the other times that P wasn't pronounced. So we're kind of like, even though we think that's the main form used in this area, it just wasn't being used. The most common ones was Mijel and Miel, kind of 2 variations of the same sort of thing. I had never noticed before, I'd never seen anybody mention that this existed before, but these 2 forms with the N at the end. Mijan and Mian. So that Mijan is red, and there's a lot here. And this is Ngukurr community, which is the one right out on the Gulf of Carpentaria coast. And I'd never heard this before. The student who was transcribing this turned around to me after transcribing it and said, I think this person is saying Mijan with an N. And I didn't believe her, and then I had to listen carefully. So it was kind of cool because part of this project we're actually learning more about Kriol as a whole and what sort of words exist in Kriol. So the pattern coming through is in this really easterly community right out over here on the coast. They're using this form with an N, which seems really unusual and I hadn't come across before. So then we can sort of map out all these findings. So going back to the first one, this na and la, in those two communities they were using those equally. So I've put them the same size. In those three communities, which is Barunga Kriol, they were using la more, but they were also using na a bit. But in this part of Roka Kriol, la was by far the most common form, and na was only used a little bit. So that was the sort of pattern of that one. With this Lagajat one, again in that area, these were the most common, Lagajat and la, the very shortened form. Whereas over that way, Layat and Lat was coming through as the most popular. And the two people from this area, the only ones I've analysed so far, were kind of a mixed soup of lots of different things. No clear pattern there, but I've still got to analyse more transcripts. And then the last one, this Miguel. So this Mijan form was the one used right out on the east in Ngukurr, and then Ngukurr was a bit of a mixed soup of different things. Miel was the most common here, but also lots of other forms as well, and same with this area. So putting those three together, we can look at, well, we thought that this was Barunga Kriol and this was Roka Kriol, but does this kind of carefully analysed data show that that is actually true? So, but we can see that actually those patterns between what was going on in these two places and what was going on over here are quite different. So while this is said to be Roka Kriol, actually looks like, I don't know, there's something different going on over here. We could maybe call it Western Roka Kriol, and maybe this is Eastern Roka Kriol. I don't know what you would call it. If I wanted to be arrogant, I could probably try and name one of the dialects after myself. But this isn't actually a new discovery. Well, new to a linguist. But I mentioned that part of the project was to get Kriol speakers' ideas themselves of what they thought the dialects were like. And about half of them drew maps like this, which matches kind of what we thought that what the dialects were, where they've grouped these communities together here, and then all these communities they've grouped together here, and they've said, yep, these people will speak the same, and these people will speak the same, and these guys are different. But about half the maps that people drew looked like this, where they actually did identify, yeah, these guys, they don't actually speak the same way as these guys, like these guys always do. So about half the Kriol speakers I interviewed already knew that this pattern existed, that this western part of the Roka area spoke differently to the eastern part. Yeah, so that maps from two women in Jordan that I interviewed.
Is there a pattern as to who drew this map compared to the other map?
I think I haven't analysed the maps too closely, but I think there would be. So this one was from Beswick, which is up here. So outside this area. So maybe there is a trend that if you're in this area, you maybe aren't so attuned to the differences here. Whereas if you're from that, I haven't looked closely, but I reckon there's a bit of a trend towards that, yeah. And then, so that's all over that way. And what about poor old Kununurra? Well, like I said, I'm a bit of an outsider here. My Kriol that I learned to speak is different from here, and I don't know the places and the people and all the family terms you guys use. So I did come here for a week in 2016, and I made a few recordings, which were useful for me to learn a few things about Kununurra Kriol. But, you know, the recordings I did, I just wasn't equipped enough to get really nice recordings of people speaking freely, so I can do all that sort of really careful analysis to put into the rest of the analysis. But found out a few little things just from my notes back in 2016 of things that struck me as a few differences from the Kriol that I'm used to. I don't know if this, it's been a while since I looked at this, but Ale, is that right? And I had the example sentence there, Ale mupakle lambara. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
That little word? That was a new word to me. So where I learned Kriol, I would say garde or warde. I said, what would you guys say? Okay, that Atmob, which I mentioned, I was talking this morning about ibin. So where I learned Kriol, that always gets pronounced as imin, with an M instead of a B, so that's different for me. And then traditional languages have an influence on Kriol as well. So two little examples there. Is that right? Read, when you look? Yeah.
Yeah.
So to look, in where I learned Kriol, you would say ngara. If you had to enter this room, but kind of just have to sneak a look about who is in the room before you go in there, is that kind of what you would do? To read?
It's not just looks for a lecture, it's sort of look around the side of someone.
So where I learned Kriol, you would say ngara or you would say roy, but that's different again. And nilik, which means is that right, that word?
Yeah.
Let's say towards. Was it towards?
Yeah, you're right.
No. So where I learned Kriol, you would say di, but. You go and dila me, which is to kill all the lice in your hair.
Yeah.
So that's a very specific word to that area. But here you can get a nilik stick and nilik, is that right? So all these little differences. Every place also has its own different family words, which are really different to me, like jalwich and the things we were talking about a bit this morning. So, starting to pick out what some of the differences are, but not really being able to do that careful analysis in terms of counting up all the examples of it. So it's kind of only a light look at differences. And then this morning we were going over a story I recorded with Dwayne, and there was just some examples of more words from Mirima in that story. Yok meaning sleep, is that right? Jilging, prawns, and Woorlab-gerring, which is nice because it has that at the end is from Kriol, but the rest is from Mirima. Some words that I would say differently, having learned Kriol in Ngukurr. So I would say nudging, but Dwayne always said nothing on the recording. Get up was new to me. I would say chakare, but Dwayne said chakimwe. Is that right? And fishing butt, whereas where I learned Kriol, I would say fishing butt. So all these little differences come up, but if you wanted to take the project further, you'd have to do these long recordings and carefully go over transcripts just to make very sure that those differences are that there's evidence that those differences are true.
I think old people would say pigeon butt.
Pigeon butt, yeah. Yeah. That's one thing I did with the project as well. I tried to only interview people kind of between the ages of 20 and 40, because older people, if they speak a traditional language, I was worried that they might use more traditional language than is what is usually spoken in the community. So I tried to just have people of a kind of a young adult age, just so I could compare a bit more evenly across everybody. But that's basically it. So that's been my project and some of the findings that are coming out of it. So back to this guy who did his dialectology in France. Just kind of tried to do the same thing he did, but instead of a bike, had a four-wheel drive and drove all over the NT and over this way. What's been really great is having documented 2 days worth of spoken conversational Kriol mostly from young people, speaking very comfortably, very naturally, like for linguists and for actually having Kriol like that recorded is really useful. Being able to think about how to use some of these methods of sociolinguistics in remote communities, and having, you know, interviews that ran for 2 hours and got to capture all this sort of interesting chat. Like, it's been really good to be able to apply those methods to this context of remote communities, and also to a Kriol language, which doesn't happen all that much. And then to put in this perceptions of Kriol speakers themselves and incorporate that into the project. That's been really interesting to be able to do that. And then also to build this really kind of evidence-based picture of what the geographic variation in Kriol looks like. So that's my project and what's been happening with it. So thank you very much for your time and your help with it as well.
This fascinating talk.
No worries, I don't know how long I spoke for, sorry if it was too long.
Time is no issue.
Okay.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, if anyone's got questions, feel free to ask.
I've got one question. I was wondering if all of the dialects are mutually intelligible to the speakers, like if they would understand each other, the speakers of different dialects?
I think so. Well, that was your impression.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's going from Halls Creek right over to Ngukurr. So what I did, so with that first map that I put up, there was a map I sort of skipped over. So my untested theory is that everything in this shaded area should be pretty much mutually intelligible, as much as English dialects are. Like if I'm talking to an American or someone from a weird part of England, there'll be things that I don't quite understand, but we can communicate. These two I'd put outside the area, so Gurindji Kriol and the Light Walpri. Those two languages are called mixed languages, where the Gurindji is so heavily mixed with Kriol that someone who from this area who just speaks Kriol really struggles to understand them. Same with Light Walpri. That's sort of the impression we get from those two. But yeah, I'd say fairly mutually comprehensible.
Maybe it's your question, but do they all like originate separately, or did it start somewhere and spread?
That's a complex question that a handful of linguists are kind of arguing over, how Kriol spreads. I think reading Joyce Hudson's work, there's evidence that in the Kimberleys there was, so it all kind of arose from Pidgin English from early kind of invasion, colonisation. That there was a Pidgin that came up through Western Australia to the Kimberleys, as well as one coming over from the NT. So I think in the Kimberley area there was a little bit of influence from something else coming through Western Australia, which, but over in the NT, I think you had Pidgin coming up and then sort of spreading from there. Some people debate whether it actually sprung up independently in different places or if it just sort of spread geographically. It's hard to tell, it's not quite what I'm trying to analyse, so I can only theorise, I suppose.
Are there any other areas in Australia where Kriol or Kriol variant is spoken?
Yeah, so there's a whole different Kriol spoken in the Torres Strait, which is unrelated, and there's a few aspects to their Kriol that's more related to what they speak in PNG. All Kriols have some similarities, but they're Kriols.
Western Kimberley isn't on the map. Was that for a reason? Or?
Probably because I just know this area so much worse than I do this area. I really don't know how far it extends.
That's just the scope of your research.
Well, does it extend past Fitzroy?
A little bit in Derby, but not much in Broome.
Yeah.
So they got a different influence. You know, they get more like Japanese influence.
Yeah, I heard there was...
Probably the most, probably Fitzroy Crossing would be where Kriol is most prevalent, I think. Followed probably by Hall Street and definitely Derby, but Broome.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's just my knowledge gets fuzzy getting over that way.
Joyce Hudson was based in Fitzroy when she wrote her stuff about Kriol.
Yeah.
What are you going to do now? Just sort of continue, you know, maybe continue?
No, well, this project, I'm only on a 3-year position to do this project, so I'm kind of taking it as far as I can in those 3 years. I mean, what happens is all the recordings get archived. If someone else wants to do analysis on it, whether it's me or another linguist, all that information is available. I guess my secret hope was that, you know, I've started this project in an area I'm really familiar with, but done it in a way so that interview that I developed, another linguist or researcher could pick it up and do it in other places and actually use the same approach and, you know, actually expand the scope of the project, whether that happens or not.
One of the most important things about making people aware of the existence of Kriol is for education of Aboriginal children in the Kimberley, because many kids are really mother tongue Kriol speakers. The teachers come from fresh out of the Teachers College in Perth, and by the time they've been here 2 years, they and the kids begin to understand one another, but it is very difficult. And I've been arguing for years that school teachers shouldn't set foot here without learning something about the fact that kids' mother tongue in many instances is Kriol. Mm-hmm. And it's still the truth. I mean, you hear kids all around here. Yeah. They don't speak standard English, and it's a contributing factor to the fact that kids drop out of school.
Mm. The same situation is with our health system as well. So patients are going out. I'm sure they're going home absolutely confused about what the doctor's just told them. They should have it that there's a person full-time in their position as a fluent Kriol speaker to break down the message of what the doctor or the nurse is just trying to relate to them. So for years and years, the school system has been trying to teach Aboriginal students standard Australian English. And it's still, you know, it's a very slow process. They should reverse that around and take a group of teachers and go and teach them Kriol. They'd be better off trying to teach adults for 6 months than trying to teach these kids for however many years for them to understand. We're talking a different language. And we're misunderstanding each other because what do you think I'm saying, I'm not saying. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think at this stage the problem will be there is no place where you can formally learn Kriol in our area.
And even getting people to admit that this is the case.
Well, you will only get them to admit it once you put a structure in place that will formalize it. We will have some linguists here in August to study the Kununurra variety of Kriol. We'll probably get a PhD student to write a full grammar of the local Kriol. Maybe that is a first step for us to actually understand, because East Kimberley Kriol hasn't been described. We've got Hudson's Fitzroy Valley Kriol grammar, which is fine, but I'm quite sure that what people speak here is very different. So we actually need to put that on paper as a first step to understand how does this Kriol differ from other Kriols, and how can you learn it?
Always influenced by the actual local traditional language as well. So,
absolutely.
If Joyce was recording in Fitzroy, it would be with Walmajari and Kununurra and Wooliyan people. So many misunderstandings happen between, you know, white people and Aboriginal people because Kriol uses many words of English base with a different meaning.
What about the LOTE teams? They come up with solutions as well of how to solve some of these issues? I know obviously their focus is, okay, let's deal with these kids here, let's have these kids understand that they can't be understood by these visiting teachers. You know, is it supposed to be them also providing strategies to the education department to resolve, you know, the fact that we are 20 years in and kids, they're still not understanding standard Australian English. They're still calling the woman Mister. This is 20 years later. You know, like something's broken here. How do you actually fix it?
Well, Mirima and Gidja both have he and she, but Kriol, we don't have
He don't, you know, like, that's it.
Got him in.
Got him in, that's it.
Yeah, that's so hard. I mean, working in, like in Ngukurr, where I've done most of my work, there is a language centre in the community, so they're actually really lucky to have that. They run just 2-day introduction to Kriol courses, and actually a lot of the teachers do it, but it just gives them a really light introduction, enough to get a few bits of info and knowledge that helps them in the classroom. But then the turnover is so high. So, you know, you'll get all the teachers doing it 1 year, and then most of them are gone by the next year, and then you have to start over again. But that community is lucky because they do have access to a course. Whereas, like you said, most places, even if there are teachers who know that it's an issue for them, where do they go? Like in the NT, there's nowhere you can go to find out about this information.
The thing that happened to me years ago when I was the full-time one here, and it happened to a colleague who years ago, when there was a K-Town Language Centre, the teachers realised that the kids can't hear the difference between P and B, T and D, K and G. So the teachers who have not had an education say, oh, we will go to the speech pathologist. The kids have a speech defect. The speech pathologist has had an education. So it happened to my friend Denise in K-Town, and it happened to me here. The speech pathologist comes in and says, well, what can the kids actually hear in their mother tongue? But, you know, that is years ago that I was asked that question. I've been to various meetings for years and tried to say, at least teachers should not set foot here without hearing that the kids can't hear the difference between pet and bet and bed, secret and sacred sound the same. So many things sound the same. As you say, the teachers, they stay 6 months or a year and then they're gone. Yeah. And the kids really can't hear the difference. And we've been telling, you know, I only have time to work on Mirima, so the place, you know, that's what I'm engaged to do. But I notice it, and getting funding to have somebody else work on Kriol as well is, you know, it's bad enough keeping the doors open as we are, and we badly want people to do.
Yeah. There's also, like, I've also heard of similar issues in speech pathology, which is a smaller field. But I know, like a friend of mine, there was a big project researching kids with FASD, I think in Fitzroy, crossing or Halls Creek? Fitzroy. And a friend of mine was a speech pathologist on that project, doing, you know, testing kids' language abilities. She had to fight really hard to actually have a test where the kids were being tested in Kriol rather than in English, to be able to say, like, actually, they, you know, to find out about their language capabilities, they need to be tested in their home language, not a second language. But she had to, like, she's one of the more enlightened speech pathologists who had to fight for that to be the case. So there's a lot of speech pathologists who still have this standard English lens. The other problem with speech pathology is that they get more funding to provide more services if there are more kids identified as deficient. So sometimes it's in speech pathologists' interests for service delivery to actually have more kids on their books that have this kind of naive, oh, they're not speaking English properly, even though we know why.
They're probably speaking Kriol properly.
Yeah, but, you know, so sometimes, well, you know, speech pathologists, well, if I have 20 kids in this community that are supposed to need my help, then I've got funding to justify visiting there. So there's more issues the more you look.
Very well, thanks again for this inspiring talk. We don't always get that high profile visit, so I'm grateful you're...
High profile is down the road. Just drove here yesterday.
So, thanks.